So, welcome everybody on the show, and it's my pleasure to have Mark Murano on our show. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Vatican. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Are you in New York, or where are you?
I'm in Washington, D.C.
You're in Washington, D.C., okay.
I'm in the suburbs right outside of Washington.
Okay, so what you have behind you is real, real visual.
Well, it's fake. It's a fake image. It's not actually outside my window, but yes.
Okay, all right, okay. So let me just briefly introduce you to the Czech audience. So Mark Murano is the founder and executive editor of ClimateDepot.com. By the way, a great website covering climate issues, and the best-selling author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change and Green Fraud, and of the recently published book called The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. I have the book with me. I finished it a couple weeks ago. Great book. And Mark's reporting has made international news, including appearances and coverage on CNN, Fox News, BBC TV, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other major mainstream outlets. Mark, you started your career during the 90s as a television reporter, producer for the nationally renowned conservative political commentator Rush Limbaugh, which I occasionally listened to when I lived on the west coast of the US 20 years ago. I'm sure it was a pretty amazing experience. How did this shape you and into what you're doing now, and being one of the kings of climate skeptics, as the magazine Newsweek called you in 2009?
Well, thank you. Yeah, that was right when I was out of college. One of my first jobs, actually, I worked on some political campaigns, but then I worked for Rush Limbaugh, the television show, and I got to be on-screen reporter. I covered Washington, D.C. for him, covered Hollywood celebrities, political marches. I got to interview celebrities like Alec Baldwin, John Ritter, and I can't even. I'm telling you, it was the entire A list, because I covered things like the Clinton inaugural with all the Hollywood celebrities in town. And what I learned from Rush Limbaugh, and I think the most important thing is, I learned how to try to be entertaining, because people, can watch the news and be interested in the news, but if you can tell them in a way that entertains you, that's a lot better. So what I did with Rush Limbaugh is I wore a hat and trench coat, and the idea is I was Rush's undercover secret agent in Washington, getting the real scoop on what was happening. So every segment would open up with me sneaking into an event, and one I had a bellhop pushing me on a luggage cart across the lobby floor, with a hat and trench coat. I'd be sneaking in the rafters in a garbage dumpster. So this is the kind of stuff I did. And then, of course, my interviews with celebrities in official Washington were a lot of fun, and I tried to keep it I tried to even make it so I'd lure them in with easy questions and then get harder. And I realized one of the greatest things we could do is when I'd go to these sort of White House, reporters' dinners, White House Correspondents' Dinner, I would hang out near the restrooms, because as the night went on, people would be going to the bathroom and they'd have a lot to drink. And I one time got Clinton's press secretary, Mike Curry, completely bombed and drunk to do an interview with Rush, which he later regretted. I also got a senator from Pennsylvania the same way. And these weren't dirty tactics. This was done in a light humor way. But I also had my camera seized at the Clinton White House in 1993. And it was covered live. They actually covered it on NBC News. They seizing my camera, and then they felt bad and then returned the camera. And that was a big deal. And I was kicked out of fundraisers and other things for the crime of working for Rush Limbaugh. So I got to see cancel culture up front and early 25 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yeah, and following your career path. Later on, you worked for the U.S. Senate, right? And you work on the 2007 groundbreaking report of 400 plus dissenting scientists, and the follow-up 2008 report of 650 plus scientists dissenting from man-made global warming fears. And in 2010, I think you published a Climate Depot special report featuring over 1,000 international scientists who had turned against the UN IPCC, the climate panel, which led later to the political scientific scandal called Climate Gate. Could you talk a bit about these years and what the Climate Gate scandal was about?
Yes, I will. Well, first of all, I went from Rush Limbaugh, and then I worked for a television and news magazine show as an investigative reporter. I worked for a Cybercast news service, and I did years of investigative journalism. I actually covered all the United Nations climate summits, environment summits, the Earth Summit in Johannesburg. So I traveled a lot. And then I went, as you mentioned, in 2007 to the United States Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. I was their researcher and the communication director. As such, I began working for Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, who just recently retired. I worked at collecting the names of scientists. This was right when Al Gore's film came out, An Inconvenient Truth. And Al Gore and the head of the United Nations, Rajendra Pachauri at the time, climate panel, said that there were only about a half a dozen or so scientists who didn't believe in man-made climate change was going to kill us all, and that they were the same number who believed the Earth was flat. So that inspired us, and I went out and I collected the names, starting, as you mentioned, with 400, grew to 650, 700. We got over 1,000 dissenting scientists. These included scientists that were former United Nations scientists, currently at Harvard, NASA, MIT. We went through the whole list, and we put it wasn't just a list of names. This was a report that had their bios, names, and their actual scientific research and commentary on their views on man-made global warming. So you would have some who would say, yeah, CO2 is a greenhouse gas, warms the climate, but it's not a catastrophe. Others would say you can't even measure the impact CO2 has. So you had a broad spectrum of scientists. And this literally helped change. It was the shot heard around the world. This report and the fact that Senator Inhofe, and it came from the United States Senate committee with the official Senate seal of the United States government, was a game changer in pushback against Al Gore's film back in 2007, 2008, 2009, because what happened was media had to start covering it. They could no longer say there were no dissenting scientists. We had thousands, or we had over 1,000 listed right there. And of course, this led to when President Obama came in, he tried to pass a climate bill in the United States. My report was read on the floor of the United States Senate in debate against it. And I'm not taking all the credit, but the bill eventually never even came up for a vote in the Senate. And Obama failed on one of his signature legislations of his climate bill back in 2010. And this was all in these scientists, and we were changing the narrative of global warming because everyone thought, well, there's no dissent. Everyone agrees. It's like, oh, yeah, well, here's top scientists from around the world, dozens of countries. It wasn't just U.S. scientists. We had plenty from Israel and Europe and Australia and New Zealand and South America. I remember Brazilian meteorologists, German meteorologists. So we had so many dissenting voices. Anyway, that all led to that. And then what happened was, at the same time as right when this happened, when Obama's climate bill failed, the United Nations emails were either hacked or they were released, and it turned out top United Nations climate scientists were colluding with journal editors and the United Nations bureaucrats to essentially set a narrative on global warming, and that anyone who dissented from that narrative would be threatened to not be published in journals, would have their funding taken away. And this is how the United Nations did it. It turned out it was a campaign cause of a small group of people at the top of the United Nations, handpicked by the UN, these scientists who literally came out and they created their own little cabal. And if you weren't part of it, they were out to destroy you. And so these emails revealed, the ClimateGate emails revealed, journal editors threatened if they posted papers. They revealed that if solar scientists got together and didn't believe that CO2 was the control knob, the scientists would then downplay that and try to remove any of that talk and remove those scientists from the United Nations. And many scientists from the United Nations resigned over this scandal. And importantly, many more who were affiliated or agreed with it then turned against it. This is how people like climatologist Judith Curry from Georgia Tech University became one of the most famous climate skeptics. She started examining what the sausage being made by the United Nations is. And what I mean by sausage is, they create the science in a way that's like they strip out anything that disagrees, and it's all a very narrow politically, basically like a political campaign when they're issuing these science reports.
Yeah. I mean, people don't realize that a lot of the climate science is scientific fraud. I mean, we might, through the interview, kind of maybe talk a little bit about the hockey stick, right? That we'll probably get to it. But Mark, you are a political scientist, right? Not a climate scientist, which you say it is to your advantage, right? Because lots of the climate science you view as a pseudoscience, and it's been proven by a lot of the, the sort of misleading science around it. It's very politicized science, right? It's more of a narrative to which scientific papers are being fit into, right? Like you have research supporting policies, not the other way around. You explain this narrative and that it's being false in the film Climate Hustle 1 that you co-produced a few years ago. Could you please talk about that, the general narrative, and why you think global warming and the so-called climate crisis is a hoax?
Okay, yes. And here's the thing. When people say, is climate change a hoax? I worked for a senator who called it. But what we're saying is not that CO2 may or may not have some effect on the climate. It may cause a slight warming, whether it can be detectable or barely detectable. What we're calling a hoax, very clearly, is the idea that carbon dioxide, humans inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide is the control knob of the climate and creating a climate catastrophe or climate emergency. And that is where, if someone wants to argue like Bjorn Lomborg and say, oh, yes, climate CO2 is a warming agent, it could cause some problems down the road, I'm not going to dispute necessarily that. But the idea that a United Nations treaty or a Green New Deal or a carbon tax or a commitment to net zero or buying an electric car is going to reverse a climate emergency. We all have to act, and there's a tipping point. We only have 10 years left. That's the hoax being perpetrated. So if you go back to the beginning of this, and I do in my first book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, and I do in my second, I have a whole chapter devoted to the 1970s man-made global cooling scare. We show you that no matter what environmental scare that has occurred, beginning in the 1960s with Paul Ehrlich's overpopulation, with resource scarcity, with running out of energy, with the man-made global cooling scare in the 70s, with even Amazon rainforest deforestation and other issues, the solution's always the same. It's an attack on capitalism, promotes socialism or Marxism, central planning, requires massive wealth redistribution, and turning the levers of control and your rights over to a small group of people to manage your lives so that you don't destroy the earth and become and create racism and havoc and create a climate catastrophe. It's literally the same solution, no matter what you're talking about. So in my book, Green Fraud, I go back to the 1970s just to show you that the solution to man-made global cooling, and by the way, before fossil fuels caused global warming, fossil fuels caused global cooling. And they thought our aerosols were blocking out the sun and creating a man-made ice age coming. And they actually were scientists at the time and proposals to put soot on the Arctic so that it would make it melt because it was getting too cold. They were blaming wars on global cooling. They blamed extreme weather like tornadoes and floods on global cooling. They had tipping points. If scientists don't act to stop the global cooling, mankind will be too late. I mean, they all the same exact tenets. And then they flipped on a dime a decade later and used all the same rhetoric, all the same tactics for man-made global cooling with the same exact solutions. So when I tell you that this is a con, or the climate con, or it's a hustle, if you will, this is what I mean. It's because it's not really about the climate. They're using climate as a means of control. In fact, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez here in the United States proposed this Green New Deal to deal with climate change. Well, the architect of that was interviewed by the Washington Post, and he said, do you think the Green New Deal is about climate? It's not about climate. This is about essentially redoing the American economy. They're using climate as an excuse to scare people. Now, having said all that, everything changed when COVID came along because they're now, they don't even care what public opinion is, or they don't care what congresswomen would vote on or not. Right. At this point, they're implementing all of this behind the scenes, a la COVID, and they want to do it through emergency orders, the same way that COVID lockdowns and church closures and wedding cancellations and funeral cancellations and delayed medical care and school closures. That was all done without a vote of democracy. It was all done under emergency order. Well, now we're seeing it happen some places in Europe. We're seeing it happen in some towns. But in the United States, Joe Biden is set, according to our mainstream news outlets, to declare a national climate emergency, which would then bypass all of this, let's persuade the public, let's have a vote in Congress. Instead, it's going to be, we have an emergency, we can do whatever the hell we want. And this would empower mayors, governors, and presidents.
Yeah, I'll definitely want to ask you about the connection between the COVID pandemic and the climate scare. But before and you sort of make the connection in this book, in The Great Reset. But before I go there, I want to ask you about the Climate Hustle 2 movie that I really like how you expose the hypocrisy of climate alarmists, right? How the global elites sort of preach water and drink wine, as the saying goes, right? Could you explain that? What you mean by, you call them a monarchy, right?
Yes. Well, the first film was 2016, and that actually dealt with the science and all the scientific claims. The second one came out in 2020, and that dealt with the sort of the climate as a religion, the climate hypocrisy, the indoctrination of children, the wacky solutions, and this whole Marxist part of it, sort of progressive vision. But you're absolutely right. When you have the head of the United Nations Climate Panel brag that he lives at 30,000 feet, meaning he flies all over the world to fight climate change, you know you have an hypocrisy problem. When you have the Davos meetings for the World Economic Forum, where they have private yachts and it's a private jet runways filling up, and you have them talking about banning meat eating for the public while they're serving meat at these events. When you have Leonardo DiCaprio, who actually said, I will fly around the world to fight global warming. When you have John Kerry confronted in Iceland and asked how he could justify flying a private jet to pick up an environmental award in Reykjavik, Iceland, his answer was, do you know who I am? I'm so important. The work I do is so important. I can't fly with those peons in commercial. No, he didn't call us peons, but the idea is they have a mindset where they're going to do what they're going to do because they're important and we're just the masses. And it's very similar to the old Soviet Politburo. If you're in the in crowd or you're in the Politburo or you're in the party and you're in good standing and you have connections, you can get the finest cuts of meat and travel and live well. But if you're the masses, you're going to be suffering. And that's what their vision is. Even when they talk about all these restrictions on travel, it's always commercial travel that they talk about. They never talk about restrictions on private planes or private jets. And then you have people like Bill Gates, who are some estimates $30,000 a month electric bills. He's putting bids in for the largest private jet transport company. Meanwhile, he's buying up American farmland, so much so that he's now the single largest American farmland owner. And his stated goal is to make us eat lab-grown meat from stem cells growing in steel vats in a laboratory, and so that we don't actually eat agricultural, livestock or actual animal meat anymore. This is a byproduct made in a lab. He's investing billions. He's going to have huge sway over agricultural policy. And that is one of the other hypocrisies here is he flies around private jets. And again, he supports COVID lockdowns. He supports all these airline restrictions. And make no mistake, they're going after every aspect of our modern life, a collapse of energy, transportation, our agricultural food system, our free speech, and even our medical care based on the climate scare.
Right. And that kind of brings us to the connections, right, between COVID and climate that you explored in your new book, The Great Reset. So outside of the elite's hypocrisy that you explain, and by the way, I remember how politicians all over the world were caught on cameras partying in large groups without the mask, right? During lockdowns, like Governor Newsom from California or, and many others.
Johnson and UK, same thing.
Yeah, it was just all over. So, the COVID hypocrisy was brought into the climate hypocrisy or vice versa. But, let's explore other similarities. Like, I see this creating fear and taking away liberties, or, the top-down control and changing people's lives, the censorship and silencing opposing views of experts, or, finally, like the radical labeling. I just recently read an article from Peter Hotez. He's like the vaccine specialist. And you just reminded me your interview you had with Bill Nye, the science engineer you debated on CNN, and they're both starting to use very strong language, right? Like against the vaccine, COVID, climate skeptics, calling them extremists and even wondering if they should be jailed, right? So could you please discuss a couple of these common threads?
Yes, well, there's an old book, 1985, I believe, called Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Well, everything I needed to know about COVID, I had already learned in the climate debate. They literally followed the exact same template. In the case of climate, what do? They come up with extreme, when current reality fails to alarm, i.e., there's no increase in hurricanes, floods, droughts, tornadoes, wildfires on climate timescales, on 30, 50, 100-year climate timescales. The UN admits this. U.S. National Climate Assessment admits this. So that's all done. So how do you generate fear? By when current reality fails to alarm, make scarier and scarier predictions of the future based on model prediction, these climate models. Well, when it came to COVID, they started out with Neil Ferguson, the virus modeler out of the UK. And what did he do? He came up with, I think it was 22 million dead, rivaling the Spanish flu, and we were all going to die. This was the most horrific virus ever. It's going to kill everyone. And the only way to save us is to follow what China did. Neil Ferguson pushed that. Anthony Fauci, the WHO pushed it. And that's what we became. So we're all going to die unless you do this draconian thing. And that's the same template in climate. We're all going to die unless you support, climate bills and Green New Deal and net zero and, UN climate treaties, et cetera. You got to give up your liberty, give up your freedom. We're sorry, but somehow, I don't even think Karl Marx saw this one coming. The idea is the only way to save death is Marxism. Marxism's the only way. When you're in times of crisis, turn to Marxism. That's essentially what that message has been in climate and what it was during COVID. So in addition, so you have COVID, the scary models, then you have their solutions, which are, again, top down, mirror exactly. The fact that they wanted to they'd shut down the global economy and locked us all in place, that was a vision of the Green New Deal. That was their number one climate solution. I've been to UN summits where they talked about planned recessions to fight global warming. Well, what was the COVID lockdowns except government-forced recessions on us? And then they lamented about car travel and airline travel. What happened during COVID lockdown? Overnight, people had stay-at-home orders and travel stopped. Airline industry grounded. Greta Thunberg wanted kids to skip school. Well, what happened during COVID? They got to skip school. They had massive transfers of wealth, although the difference here is they didn't want to help the poor people. This was the biggest transfer of wealth in COVID lockdowns from the poor and middle class to the wealthy. In other words, the people that made record profits were the Amazons and were the Walmarts and were the big chain stores and was Wall Street and the billionaire class. I think there was estimates of, new billionaires every few days were being created. The largest creation of billionaires, largest transfer of wealth from everyone, because everyone went into frozen and then people cashed in. And of course, the pharmaceuticals made money. So this was exactly the way the climate template wanted. They want them, the chosen few are empowered. They get to impose it upon everyone else using fear. Now, the difference was climate activists were at first extremely jealous. They were like, I can't believe this. We've been at this for years. John Kerry then came out and said, the parallels between COVID and climate are screaming at us. A teen climate activist in Teen Vogue said, if we can shut down the world for a virus, we can do the same thing for climate. And everyone's like, yeah. Then you had a Bill Gates, George Soros funded professor, Mariana Mazzucato in Europe, actually write a paper saying it might be time for another lockdown, this time a climate lockdown. Now, that's not some fever imagination of a climate denier. This was a Bill Gates, George Soros-funded professor using the phrase climate lockdown. So it became incredible. So what's happened since with COVID and climate, they've literally merged them. So now you have the Harvard School of Medicine basically say unchecked climate change leads to more COVID-like viruses. You have 230 of the world's biggest medical journals coming out with a joint statement. This is 2021 saying that we need to have the same template to fight climate change as we used for COVID. In other words, massive executive order, lockdown, bypassing a democracy, and basically scaring the hell out of the public. There has been no doubt about where they're headed with this. We just had a doctor a few weeks ago at the American College of Anesthesiologists talk about lowering the amount of anesthesia in patients because the carbon footprint of anesthesia was too high. Not to improve patient care, but to improve planetary care. This is actually what they're saying. Harvard Medicine is now including a climate change curriculum in their curriculum. You have the doctor in Canada and a whole group of them joined together a group. The first doctor in the world actually diagnosed a patient as suffering from climate change at the end of 2021. And it was a patient who was suffering from heat stroke. You have academics in Australia who published a paper calling for climate change to be added as a cause of death on death certificates. You have the World Health Organization now declare climate change as the greatest public health threat of the 21st century. So what they've now done is they realize that people are scared as shit about viruses. So let's now merge climate and COVID together, and we can use the same template, i.e., emergency powers. We can use it through medical prescribed medical procedures, and this is where they're headed. And that's what it's incredible now to watch. And in my book, I go through all the incredible similarities just between. Another big one I left out here, and this is important to mention, is in the climate debate. If you were a dissenting scientist, you were uninvited from conferences, your journal publishing would end, you would have no money, and you could lose your professorship at a university. Well, what happened during COVID? The exact same thing. I detail in the book epidemiologists, Nobel Prize winning from Stanford and Harvard and Yale, who dissented not against viral data, but against lockdowns or vaccine mandates. And they were literally uninvited to scientific conferences. They were literally deplatformed, defunded, threatened with their jobs. In one case, Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford University said all of the people on his, it was Jay Bhattacharya told the story, but it was Trump's climate advisor, COVID advisor, who all of his colleagues at his university in California wrote letters basically smearing him. I mean, your colleagues turn on you if you don't toe the line. So the difference was incredible. And I detail in the book how a polar bear scientist 10 years ago was uninvited from scientific conferences and literally deplatformed because his views did not support the climate narrative. And then we saw the exact same thing happen. So it leads me to this, which is an important point. When they talk about the consensus on climate, the 97% consensus, first of all, it's based on several different studies. One of the studies was 77 anonymous scientists. It wasn't even 97 scientists. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they're from. We just know it's some blank survey they whittled down from 10,000 names. And then another survey was based on studies and papers, and that was ended up being completely debunked and defrauded. It was a study from Australia. So the same thing happened then with the COVID, is that people who tried to dissent on it were deplatformed and censored. And this is what we see. For one example, the Biden EPA has scientific advisory boards. And they got rid of, I think, over 50 of these scientist advisors because they didn't think they would agree with their policies. They knew who they were. They knew how they advised in the past. They literally removed them in 2020, I believe it was 2022. So what does that mean? That means the Biden administration can now credibly claim any climate or environmental rule. Hey, look, we have 100% consensus with our scientists. Well, it's easy to get 97% or 100% consensus when you literally fire, eliminate, deplatform, and silence anyone who might disagree. And that's what's happened both in the climate world and the COVID world.
Right. And exactly like you say, I mean, crisis is an opportunity to change people's behavior, to transfer wealth. It's, fear just makes you do things that you wouldn't do otherwise. I mean, it's a it's it's a historical tool, a kind of divide and conquer. And it seems like it's getting crazier and crazier and more extreme, like with the Chinese balloon and shooting down the UFOs, right? People now have to be scared of aliens, and it's like you were saying with anesthesia. I mean, it's getting crazy every day. But what I would like to kind of change a little bit in the book Great Reset and other interviews that I listened to, you appreciate the courage and work of many Democrats and left-leaning progressive like Robert Kennedy Jr., or I think you even mentioned Michael Moore, his film Planet of the Humans, criticizing the Green New Deal. And at the same time, you have been fairly critical, of Donald Trump, for instance, and some of his policies during lockdown. Yet you yourself are a Republican. Don't you think it's time to get beyond the two-party illusion? With everything of what's going on, I mean, do you feel and do you sense that it really kind of brought people together? The pandemic and the climate scare and the lockdowns.
It really has. And I devote a whole chapter in my book, The Great Reset. It's no longer left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, labor versus conservative. It's now freedom versus tyranny. And what you'll find, and I will tell you now, I now consider Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, I would have nothing to do with them. They are vile, evil. These are people who literally have no problem with the status quo. They're interested in the endless war, the military-industrial complex. My views have changed dramatically in terms of that, or they've really accelerated away from that. Now, they're Republicans, but I can't stand them. In fact, if you get every Republican nominee since Ronald Reagan, I liked Ronald Reagan, but you can have George H.W. Bush, you can have Bob Dole, you can have George W. Bush, you can have John McCain and Mitt Romney, and you can shit can them all. They're pathetic. I'll take Donald Trump. I'll take a Ron DeSantis, although I need to know more about him. But what's happened, though, aside from that, that's just internal Republican. I was very critical of Donald Trump because again, and I was screaming, and many people were screaming at him not to go along with this. By him signing that emergency decree in March of 2020 to declare a national COVID emergency, we're still living under it in the United States. It doesn't end until this May. And there was a couple other things he did.
The Operation Warp Speed, right?
Well, that was separate. That came later. I'll get to that in a second. But these are executive powers. So what happened was these emergency powers kicked in. This gave the federal government unbelievable power, things like the mask mandate on planes, trains, automobiles. This gave mayors and governors dictatorial powers. Overnight, they could be dictators. You're going to do lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, and if you can report your neighbor if you see too many people at a backyard barbecue, and you will listen to us, and you will have churches closed and school closing, and I alone, governors and unelected bureaucrats literally took over. No vote anymore, and this is what they love. This is why Jane Fonda, the climate activist, progressive, said COVID was God's gift to the left because it gave them everything they wanted, modeled after communist China. In fact, one of the things I point out in the book is for decades, the New York Times, Justin Trudeau, Obama administration, Hollywood, the Apple CEO have all praised, and I have the quotes, literally praised China's one-party authoritarian rule. COVID came along and literally gave the once free West an opportunity to mimic China's one-party authoritarian tyranny, and we did, and they all loved it. And this is why they don't want to give it up. What they admired for decades, they suddenly were able to do. That's why we're still living under a COVID emergency here in the United States. So what Donald Trump did is he allowed that to happen, and it took him way too long to fight back on all of this. We lost months because Trump he listened to his advisors. His instincts were good. Mike Pence is an absolute joke. Trump's vice president just came out with a book where he brags about getting ventilators and masks to people. He brags about helping with Operation Warp Speed, the vaccines. He has nothing to say bad about any of the COVID lockdowns, which to me disqualifies him immediately from ever seeking any office, including dog catcher. But Donald Trump's other major mistake was he put out, this comes from him being a private businessman with a lot of bravado. He wanted to be the first. He wanted to be the greatest. He wanted to rush a vaccine, Operation Warp Speed for COVID. The problem is you don't rush an mRNA vaccine that they've been trying to get on us. And you can actually find quotes of people from Fauci, other public health, saying they wish there was some kind of public emergency. Otherwise, these vaccines will take decades and they may never come to light. And there's been so much time and money invested in them. Well, Trump rushes it and then leaves office. And then what happens? The vaccine that was rushed then gets mandated for the military, for workers to go to a restaurant all across America and the world, access to your own bank accounts. In some countries, you couldn't even access your own money in the bank unless you got this vaccine. So it turns out it affects your fertility, it affects women's cycles, it affects men's semen. And I actually compare that to what Paul Ehrlich wanted in 1969. He wanted a hidden sterilization agent in our drinking water in Africa, in the United States, to control population. Well, right. It sure sounds like we got it now in this kind of a vaccine, or you could say it's plausible. And again, my sources on what I just mentioned on fertility are the New York Times, and you can actually check my Twitter file and look that up. I have the articles or studies that the New York Times covered about women's monthly cycles and men's sperm counts. So this is reported by mainstream media. These are not like, that's an important thing to note about my book. I don't I have secret document I can't reveal. No, I use BBC, Washington Post, New York Times, Der Spiegel, all the major mainstream outlets, and the World Economic Forum, their book called The Great Reset, quotes from their leaders. None of this is hidden, anything I'm describing to you. So that's what Donald Trump, to bring it around to a quick ending here with this answer. So what we have now, I interviewed Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in 2014, and he was a climate activist. He told me that climate skeptics, and particularly the heads of these fossil fuel companies, belonged at The Hague with all the other war criminals with 3 square meals and a cot. He said 3 hots and a cot, 3 square hot meals and a cot. He wanted to jail fossil fuel executives and climate skeptics. So in this book, because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. emerged as one of the leading voices of sanity and liberty against mask mandates, vaccine mandates, lockdowns, the biomedical terrorist state being imposed on us, I said in my book, The Great Reset, all is forgiven for wanting to jail me, because he came around. People like Naomi Wolf, who was a Bill Clinton, Al Gore advisor, a feminist, became one of the greatest voices of liberty. I feature her in the book. Jimmy Dore, who is a progressive lefty who wants socialized medicine, he literally has been one of the greatest voices. I say as a man who worked for Rush Limbaugh from the beginning almost of Rush Limbaugh's career, I can honestly say I haven't seen anyone like Rush Limbaugh since Jimmy Dore, and he's a man on the left, but daily he rails against the Great Reset, against Big Pharma, against the military-industrial complex, against school lockdowns, against mask mandates and school closures. He is an incredible advocate for liberty. Also, other Democrats like Cynthia McKinney, I put in the book, and many others. Russell Brand is another one worth noting. A Hollywood left-wing socialist has become one of the greatest voices of liberty as well. And you can see this happening. Fox News in America will have now what used to be enemies of their message on these conservative talk shows, Tucker Carlson and Jesse Waters. They'll now appear on the show, and they're in all agreement on this. So it's been a major political realignment, and I say we have to embrace them. People like Michael Moore, we're not going to agree on much, but if we agree with him on green energy, let's work with him on that. You got to build coalitions. We can't just dismiss people because, they're a progressive or a lefty or a socialist, whatever it is, the same way they would dismiss us with a similar thinking. We need to get together because the common enemy is the establishment, and they want us bickering over nonsense. It's the George Bushes, it's the Bill Clintons, it's the United Nations, it's the World Health, it's the Bill Gates. And we have to do coalitions against it. And unfortunately, people like Kevin McCarthy, the House Republican leader, I don't consider him, anything. I don't consider him on the side of fighting on the side of liberty. Although he could help slow down some of the tyranny, maybe.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Mark. Unfortunately, we agreed that we'll keep the interview 45 minutes up to an hour. So let me kind of wrap it up with, and I want to, respect your time and our agreement. I want to wrap it up with maybe one or two final questions. Sure. You also, which kind of caught my attention, you said that some of the climate scientists, alarmists, view the climate and the atmospheric processes as an engineering problem, right? It's a technological fix. This is also what the geoengineering strategies are. I'm sure you are aware of the solar radiation management by, injecting chemicals, particles such as aluminum or sulfur oxides to the lower stratosphere, like David Keith, from Harvard, the geoengineer, is proposing in order to reduce global warming, which seems like we don't have one. So what do you think of geoengineering, weather modification and the whole,
Yeah, the good question. My first thought is it's a giant boondoggle, but in a waste of money. However, it's always going to be there because there are so many people who want to get federal funds, beginning with smaller things like carbon capture and sequestration. We have that in the United States, where federal dollars, state dollars, government money, taxpayer money goes to these private companies who make all sorts of promises and look into it, and they start trying to capture carbon dioxide underground, which creates a whole nother series of problems in terms of pressure and in terms of just even keeping accounting correct of it. So these are boondoggles. Then you mentioned the atmosphere. You have China bragging that they've had successful weather modification with snow and rain. Russia claiming the same thing. Joe Biden just said after a tornado outbreak last year in 2022 that we can't control the weather yet. He made some bizarre comment like that. But you mentioned, I don't know if you mentioned this, but Harvard, Bill Gates is investing billions and injecting essentially to block out the sun, injecting some kind of aerosols to block out the sun and try to cool the earth that way. So at the very least, it's a waste of money. At the very worst, it's monkeying around and engineering stuff. We have no business and have no knowledge of what other side effects we could create if we do it. Luckily, government is generally so inept that I'm hoping all these attempts completely fail, because it'd be frightening to think if they could start controlling the weather through some Bill Gates funded aerosol injection or other type things with cloud seeding or other measures that they're taking.
Oh, are you there, Mark?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Just at the last 10 seconds, you got out. Right. Yeah, but yeah, I get it. And, it's funny that Biden said that we cannot control the weather yet, when Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, later president in the 60s, said those who control the weather can control the world, right? And fascinating book I recommend. I don't know if you read it, by James Fleming, Fixing the Sky, The Checkered History of Weather and Climate Control.
Yes, I interviewed him for my radio show.
Yeah, it's fascinating, that we have been trying to modify the weather since the 40s, the 50s, and it's, some of the geoengineers and those who are around the weather modification kind of talk about the extreme weather and the climate instability that maybe possibly could be also caused by the tinkering, with the weather and the climate that we have done artificially, the different projects like Project Cirrus and Storm Fury and not only the US, like you said, Soviet Union, China and Israel and other countries, now Saudi Arabia, are in the business of weather modification. So, maybe what I know you don't believe in extreme weather events, but it seems like, there are all these technologies that could cause redirecting, hurricane, or causing floods or droughts.
A lot of talk, particularly hurricanes. If a hurricane's about to make landfall, there's a lot of people who have all kinds of whether weapons or atmospheric pressure devices to try to push it off land, and so it's dangerous. But this is part of what this global elite like to talk about. In fact, whether it's talking even about transgender, transforming a woman into a man, or vice versa, they it's like a Dr. Frankenstein there. But then you also have the World Economic Forum bragging about brain implants where you'll be able to measure an audience reaction. And this was done on the stage of Davos. It's in my book with not Václav Klaus, but with the president of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab.
Yeah.
He literally was talking to the head of Google, Sergey Brin, the co-founder, and they were talking about brain implants and how wonderful it'll be in a few years. They'll be able to know the audience reaction. So it's this whole mindset of they want to be masterminds of the world, be it the weather, be it human beings, and be it all aspects of the economy as well. I mean, that's what they're trying to do.
Right. He was it an Israeli scientist and professor?
Harari, yes.
Yeah, Yuval Harari. The audience can look at YouTube. I think there is this video how we can hack the humans, right?
Yeah, he said that literally he's the chief advisor to Klaus Schwab.
Right. And
he said that with automated intelligence and with the new economy coming, we're going to have useless eaters, a huge part of the population, which will have no service whatsoever. He has two solutions. One is get them addicted to video games and their mindless numbing and to keep them. And the second is to use psychotropic drugs to medicate them into basically dormant human beings. And that's what they're saying. They're saying the quiet part out loud. So you can imagine what the quiet part must be. If there must still be a quiet part. I don't even want to know what that is.
Yeah. It's a total control. Anywhere you look, from the COVID pandemic to the climate scare, to artificial intelligence, hacking humans. And that's what you say, and the tyranny, it's freedom or tyranny, and it's exactly it, the total control of everything. So in conclusion, Mark, one thing that fascinated me was that you interviewed Václav Klaus, right? The Czech former president, or, the Czech historian Vítězslav Kremlík. So for some reason, you have, Czech Republic is a small country. So it's not very common that, people know some Czech people. Have you been to the Czech Republic, or how did you get to meet Václav Klaus?
I met Václav Klaus first time in Washington years ago, like 2012. Actually, I met him in Chicago at a different climate event. And then I went in 2016 is when I flew to Prague, interviewed Václav Klaus for the movie Climate Hustle 2, and also for my book, Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. And he's in all three of my books, actually. But it was fascinating. I got to go to his presidential library right there in Prague. I also interviewed a couple of the members of parliament there, EU members. And I also know, long time going back, almost 20 years now, Lubos Model, the former Harvard professor, who's now a Czech physicist with a local university there. So I'm in regular contact with him. But I guess the reason we're drawn to Czech Republic is the love of freedom that you guys have above and all else other European nations. I don't know what the cause of that is. I've even heard that your country has higher rates of climate skepticism than other European countries.
Oh, yeah. Well, definitely it's so important these days to, have the reflection of the totalitarian state and how fast can you, slide to it. And during the COVID pandemic, a lot of people realized that there were so many similarities, and, you can lose freedom so quick. And it's important to really, to remind this to people, right? That freedom is something, that we really need to work for and cherish, and that the global elite can just quickly, it's been their goal all along, right? To control humanity. So we just cannot let it happen.
In my book, I quote Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, who says basically throughout history, it has been very few exceptions that mankind has been free and well off. Most of history, most of mankind, they've been miserable and under tyranny. And that's why people think the last couple hundred years are really an anomaly. In your country, it's only the last 30 years, I guess. Mm-hmm. But I'm talking about people in Western Europe and the United States. They don't really think it could happen to them. And there's always been this sort of cavalier attitude like, oh, that would never happen here. Well, COVID came along and showed you a lot of what you never thought could or would happen did happen.
Right. And look what happened in the 30s to Germany, right?
Yeah, in the book I go back.
It's incredible. Yeah.
That's abuse of emergency power. In the book, I go back with a BBC historian to the Roman Republic, through the Middle Ages, through 1933 Germany, through even 9/11, through COVID. During times of emergency powers by government is when the greatest human rights abuses have historically happened. So that's when we should be most concerned. That's why I'm very concerned here in the United States of talk of a climate emergency being declared by the government. We already know what the 9/11 terrorist emergency got us. We're still living under that from September 2001.
Yeah, the Patriot Act. Yeah.
The Patriot Act, but it gave us our government spying on our own citizens for our own good. And
it's been renewed again, right? It's incredible.
Yeah, that's what I mean when you say. So to me, I can't even vote or consider a Republican. They have to be against aid to Ukraine. They have to recognize the CIA and the FBI as biosecurity terrorism at this point, who are against the interests of the United States. They have to recognize what happened during COVID, like Nikki Haley, a Republican, just announced. She had a speech last year where she's running as a Republican against Donald Trump for president. She had a speech last year in New York City where you had to have a vaccine passport to get into her speech. Right. She didn't mention anything. She has no problems with lockdowns and vaccines. Just not part of her issue. Her big issue is we need to basically continue to be the policeman of the world and continue with all these wars. This is where you have to start realizing that where Donald Trump was great for everyone is he became a litmus test. Because the establishment hated Donald Trump because he wasn't one of them. So people who you thought were good, freedom-loving people turned out to be nothing but deep state establishment hacks. And the way you could tell is how they attacked Donald Trump or didn't attack him.
Right. And from COVID pass, it's just around the corner to carbon tracking and being locked in 15-minute cities, right? And green pass. And it's so...
Here's the thing. If I were running for president, I would talk about we're going to stop the collapse of energy, stop the collapse of transportation, stop the collapse of agriculture and free speech and medicine. Particularly transportation, just to give you an example, it's following the COVID model. You have the World Bank saying they're not going to fund gas-powered cars. You have Australian banks and other corporate banks saying they're not going to give out car loans to people who buy gas-powered cars by 2035. You have the EU banning gas-powered cars through, I guess that was probably a vote. I don't think that was an executive order. But in the United States, we have one governor, California, issue an executive order, unelected board comes up with the timetable to ban gas-powered cars, 21-state trigger law. Biden administration may make it a federal mandate. So cars are being taken away from us without a vote of the public, without warning. Meat is being taken away from us. Bill Gates buying up the land, lab-grown meat, pushing insect eating, collapse of high-yield agriculture through net zero pledges that courts are now enforcing throughout Europe. We're seeing in the Netherlands. So they're taking away our meat, our high-yield agriculture. They're taking away our gas-powered cars. They're taking away our energy based on a lie that, solar and wind will be cheaper and more plentiful. None of that came out to be true. They've taken away our free speech through corporate government collusion. So the idea is, hey, we're a private company. We can censor you, but the government can't. Well, then it turns out the government sent documents telling them censor these people, and then these private companies did. So this fascism is what our biggest enemy is.
And right.
Anyone running for office in Europe or the U.S., this should be their opening speech, what I just said. Instead, you hear crap like, we need term limits for politicians, and we need to have age, a cognitive test for people over 75, and no new taxes. It's like, I'm sorry, you're not dealing with today's world. You're dealing with 1990 maybe, but it's all bullshit to sit here and listen to it. So and Donald Trump has problems. Donald Trump and even DeSantis has problems. So we'll see if all these people can catch up.
I loved how you finished the book. You talking about, from the Great Reset to the Great Reject. Right?
The Great Reject, yes.
And that's exactly it.
The lowest level of politics in the United States had the most change. Angry parents showing up at school board meetings literally created a sea change to the point where every major city, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Washington, Baltimore, San Francisco, LA, lifted their vaccine and mask mandates because these angry parents literally switched elections and upset COVID lockdown politicians. And the New York Times said the Democrat Party did focus groups and realized it was the states with the parent-led rebellion against the school and COVID theater that led to these upset elections, which then scared all these major liberal cities into dropping the COVID vaccines last year.
Right.
So parents at the lowest level of school actually had, and by the way, they were labeled domestic terrorists, all going back to the Patriot Act and 9/11.
Exactly.
The surveillance state turned against its own. If you're against the U.S. government, you're a terrorist. I'm sorry, I thought that's what America was founded on. We're supposed to be able to criticize our government.
Yeah. People shouldn't forget that they have incredible powers, even though, they are being told that they don't have any and they need to just listen to the government. Mark, great. Thank you so much. I could just talk to you for another hour or two.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And, I wish you all the best in your work. And when you come to the Czech Republic, let me know. I'd love to have a cup of coffee with you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.